Everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Laying the Groundwork, How States Can Improve Access to Continued Education for People in the Criminal Justice System. We are excited to have the opportunity to share some of the key findings and recommendations stemming from this national study and report with you that we released just 2 weeks ago. I'm Josh Weber. I'm the Deputy Director of the Corrections and Reentry Division in the Council of State Governments Justice Center. I will be moderating the panel today. If you're not familiar with the Council of State Governments Justice Center, we are a national nonprofit organization that provides evidence-based, consensus-based advice to all branches of state government as well as local government on how to improve outcomes for youth and adults in the justice system. We do that through a variety of different program areas, including a focus on corrections, reentry, justice reinvestment, juvenile justice, and economic mobility. I'm happy to be joined today by 4 great panelists who will be answering a series of questions to share key findings and recommendations from the report. First, I'm joined by Haley Glover, who is Strategy Director of the Lumina Foundation. We're very excited and grateful for the Lumina Foundation's support of this project. Next, I'm joined by Ruth Stadheim, Director of Career and Technical Education for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. Also on our panel are Leah Bacon and Gina Lee, who are policy analysts with the Council of State Governments Justice Center and who were the lead researchers on this project. The format of today's webinar will be question and answer with our panelists as a way of informally highlighting the key findings and best practices of this report. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for participants' question and answers. At any time, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A chat box, and we will get to as many of them as possible. At the end of the webinar, we will be sending out the slides used in the webinar, and we will also be able to have an opportunity to answer additional questions. Also, if you are having any technical difficulties during the course of the webinar, you can pose your concern or your question in the chat box, and they will be addressed. To start out with, I'd like to provide just a brief overview of the study methodology and structure before getting to our panelists. Our goal of the study was to assess whether states have the fundamental statutory, administrative, and funding building blocks in place to provide people with high-quality post-secondary education programs and services while incarcerated and when they return to the community. In order to conduct that assessment, we conducted a 50-state policy and practice scan, which included online and legislative research, as well as 2 national surveys that were sent out and completed by all 50 state correctional as well as parole granting agencies. Our analysis and the findings and recommendations that we'll be sharing today are organized around 4 building blocks that research and best practice have shown are critical to improving post-secondary access and quality for those who have been involved with the criminal justice system. The first building block is funding. And whether states are really using and maximizing existing federal funding streams, including Perkins, Pell, and WIOA federal funding, as well as state financial aid funding to support post-secondary access and success for those involved in the criminal justice system. The second building block was offerings, and the criteria for that building block was whether states are providing a full range of career and technical education, associate's and bachelor's degree programming available to all people who are incarcerated, and whether that programming was primarily based on local labor market trends as well as employer feedback. The third building block was restrictions, and whether states are really minimizing and eliminating both statutory as well as administrative restrictions on who can access post-secondary education within correctional settings. And finally, the fourth building block was incentives and supports. And that building block identifies whether states are providing tangible and concrete incentives to people while incarcerated to participate and persist in their post-secondary education studies, as well as providing tangible supports when people return back to the community to connect with further post-secondary education and receive continued education and support. To start out with, I'd like to turn to Haley. And Haley, if you can address really what spurred this project from the Lumina Foundation's perspective, and why should states in the field really care about improving access to post-secondary education for people who are involved in the criminal justice system?
Thanks so much, Josh. Just checking that you can hear me. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, I panicked for a moment. Well, thanks for the question, and I think it's actually a really important one. We initiated this project for a couple reasons. Lumina Foundation is a national private foundation, and we focus exclusively on post-secondary attainment, meaning the proportion of adults in our country who have attained some form of post-secondary education after high school. Our work with the incarcerated and reentering population is still relatively new to us. We kicked this off about 3 years ago. In the process of learning as much as we could and talking to as many people as we could, we were very surprised to find so little information about the policy environments in the states. Which states had funding bans, which had taken steps to make sure that learners with backgrounds could access opportunities without bias, which had policies in place to ensure learning gained inside prisons was transferable toward credentials outside, and so on. And then we heard a lot of anecdotes from policy leaders that indicated that many really didn't know about their own environments. We heard one story about a state leader who learned there was a funding ban on education inside prisons in place, and she went to the leader of the other caucus, and he wasn't aware that there was a ban in place either. So we wanted to help states gain a little better understanding of the current state and, of course, help them understand where they can make progress. So Lumina does a great deal of work with states, including state higher education leaders, governors, policy advisors, and the like. 43 states have established post-secondary attainment goals, goals for particular proportions of their adult populations to earn a certification or a certificate or a degree. More states are leaning toward establishing clearly articulated goals to close attainment gaps, those pervasive differences in credential completion between white population and Black, Latinx, and Native American populations. Simultaneously, of course, we have an environment of very low unemployment, big talent gaps, and a looming labor shortage. And of course, we have very significant racialized rates of arrest, conviction, and sentencing inside prisons. And so as we look at this whole ecosystem together to meet our attainment goals, to close our attainment gaps, work inside prisons and with recently released populations is very square in our priorities. And we're eager for states to look at the information that CSG Justice Center has raised in this report and reflect on the barriers they've created for people with criminal backgrounds, and then take steps to remove those barriers. No state has the talent to waste, and every state we think has a great deal to gain by making sure that those who've been incarcerated have a chance to fully participate in society and contribute to stable families and communities.
Thanks so much, Haley. I'll briefly just add to Haley's comments that we were really struck when we conducted the research for this study about how compelling the research is about the benefits of post-secondary education. A recent meta-analysis of over 50 studies was conducted and shown that folks who are incarcerated, if they receive any form of post-secondary education, that is associated with a 48% decrease in recidivism rates when people re-enter the community. Additionally, research has shown that being provided with vocational training and support leads to a 28% increase in likelihood of finding employment. So the research findings are really compelling, that providing post-secondary education is one of the most cost-beneficial actions and programs and supports that states as well as locales can provide to this really important population. So with that, Leah, I'd like to turn to you, and if you can talk a little bit about the most important or interesting finding that really stood out to you from the study, and how you think these findings really highlight the need for state reform.
Thanks, Josh. I want to provide a brief overview of our overall findings and analysis. We found that no state is fulfilling all 4 of the fundamental building blocks that Josh recently discussed, with less than half of the states meeting the criteria for each of the building blocks. Now, each of us will go into further detail on each of these areas. So I'll start off with funding. For funding specifically, our findings revealed that 17 states are tapping into at least one of the federal funding streams. This includes Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act funds, the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act funds, and/or Second Chance Pell Pilot funds. And so the second part of the criteria for this building block is that the state's state-based financial aid has no restrictions on who can access it. This means that both incarcerated and formerly incarcerated students have full access to the financial aid programs offered in the state. Now, there are 3 main federal funding streams that we looked at, and we asked states to self-report on if any amount of these funds were being used for post-secondary education for people incarcerated. 3 states self-reported using all 3 federal funding streams, while 5 states self-reported not using any. There are 2 pieces that I want to emphasize on this. 1, there needs to be more interagency discussion on if or how these federal dollars are being allocated and spent to serve this population. We want to ensure that the DOCs are aware of the funding being utilized by institutions of higher education or departments of higher education and vice versa. And 2, don't leave money on the table. We want state legislators and department heads to better understand Perkins and WIOA and the allocations that are available to them to use for this purpose of providing post-secondary education within their state correctional facilities. Now, when we talk about state-based financial aid, 2/3 of states have some form of restrictions on who can access this aid. I think one of the most interesting findings is the range of restrictions and discrepancies on accessing state-based financial aid for either incarcerated people and/or formerly incarcerated people. Now, in some states, only incarcerated people are restricted from using state aid, and others, these restrictions stem after incarceration. Some states have a ban of a couple years post-incarceration. Some restrict those convicted of drug-related charges or those convicted with felony convictions, etc. So what we see is a wide range of barriers here. But one I find particularly noteworthy is that some state aid does not have explicit or statutory restrictions for incarcerated people, but the policy or the practice of the Higher Education Authority is adhering to Pell eligibility requirements to determine eligibility for that state financial aid program, thus creating a restriction for incarcerated people. It is a practice that I believe states should be cognizant of and determine if that measurement is really necessary when granting state financial aid.
Thanks, Leah. And we know that the federal government is beginning to explore whether changes should be made in that Pell eligibility criteria. And so, as Leah said, it's something that we really encourage states to explore as well, to have as few restrictions on who can benefit from financial aid as possible. Ruth, I'd like to turn to you, and if you can talk a little bit about what you found most interesting in the offerings building block and share a little bit with us about what Minnesota is doing.
It offers a large number of career technical construction trade programs: carpentry, cabinet making, drywall, installation and repair, floor covering, engineer drafting and design, heavy equipment operator, masonry, network cabling, production technology, painting and decorating, solar panel installation, clean energy, machining, manufacturing skills, mechatronics, and welding. We also offer several computer careers programs from Microsoft Office Specialist, Help Desk, A+ computer maintenance and repair, desktop publishing, and in addition, we offer barbering, cosmetology, and office support. Minnesota also offers higher education programming with coursework towards an Associate of Arts degree, courses towards transferring into a bachelor's degree, and coursework towards a specific bachelor degree program. There are several ways that we ensure that we are offering the highest quality programming. The higher ed education coursework is provided by our Minnesota State colleges and taught by their faculty. They use the same textbooks and curriculum that they would on a college university campus, and students receive college transcripts for the Minnesota State system. Our barbering and cosmetology programs are overseen by the Minnesota Boards of Barbering and of Cosmetology. Both instructors must be licensed as barbers or cosmetologists, following the licensing guidelines for their curriculum, staying current on licensing changes. They must be licensed as a school manager, and then the prison facility must be licensed as a cosmetology school or a barbering school in order to teach the programs with the prisons. The instructors can then conduct the state board licensing exams in the classrooms, and the exams are reviewed by the licensing respective boards. These programs are also audited annually by their respective board. For the other career tech programs, we have a partnership with our Minnesota State College system. One of the colleges, Century College, sends a representative in to review all of our programs. They review the instructors' credentials, bios, resumes, the course syllabi, the curriculum, and all course documents. The college also observes the programs in session, reviews the use of equipment, materials, and supplies, and utilizes a detailed rubric to ensure that every element is complete and thorough. When the college approves the programs as being college level, then we are able to provide college transcripts to the students from the Minnesota State College system. The transcripts does not say that it's a prison setting, but it's a regular college transcript. Embedded in all of our programs, we include industry-recognized certification opportunities. We work with the Manufacturing Skills Standard Council, the National Center for Construction Education Research, the Federal Department of Labor for OSHA and forklift training, the American Welding Society, the National Institute for Metalworking Skills, our CTEC Network Cabling Corporation, the North American Board of Certified Energy Practitioners, and several Microsoft certification opportunities, the Minnesota Cosmetology License, and the Minnesota Barber License. All of these certifications require that the program instructors to test the students on the respective official industry exams, send the exams in for grading, and then the certification is awarded. All of our programs have advisory committees specific to the program's industry field. The advisory committees are made up of business and industry experts for the respective program that they represent. The members review the curriculum being used, they tour and observe the programs annually, make recommendations for curriculum additions or changes, and for current technology, equipment needs, and uses. One example of a recommended inclusion to our programs is the need to teach soft skills. We call this workplace human relations. This includes a 60-hour course on communication and relationships in the workplace, how to work with team members, and how to work under a supervisor. The course also includes workplace ethics and diversity, and it's a requirement of every one of our career tech programs. We are often asked how we choose the programs that we offer. We look at what the state of Minnesota needs for a workforce and what industries people with felonies can work in. Of course, there are individual circumstances, but we work with the students individually on their career choice to ensure that they're getting into an industry training that they'll be able to actually work in once they complete. We use our Minnesota Department of Economic and Employment, the information for supporting program choices. Not only do we look at an industry growth potential, but we also look at the replacement openings that are projected for the next 10 years. That number is usually very large. And we are helpful with the labor shortage. And lastly, we have a really great initiative right now with the hiring of career navigators. We received some private funding that allowed us to hire these people. The navigators work with all of our career tech students to ensure that they get into the training program that fits their career goals, helps them prepare for reentry to the community, and then when they're released, They will work with the employers to match skill sets so that the student gets into the right job. The navigator follows them out to the communities, and they'll follow them for 3 years to ensure that they're doing a good job. They communicate openly with their employers and their release agent, making sure the new hire is doing well. The hope is that we're able to sustain the positions and potentially hire more so that we can expand to other members of our prison population. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ruth. So it's really great to hear about the work that's happening in Minnesota because, as you see, only 17 states met the building block criteria for offerings. And actually what we found was most of the states actually do offer occupational training and certifications, associate's degree programming, and bachelor's degree programming, but it was really that alignment with local labor market trends, that partnership with employers, designing programs that were specifically for the state workforce that Ruth really highlighted, where a lot of the states fall short. And we know, given the challenges that folks in the criminal justice system have with coming back to the community, having to overcome employer bias, having to overcome a lot of other barriers to finding employment, aligning curricula really with what employers are looking for is really critical for providing effective employment services for this population. So now I'd like to shift to the third building block, which is restrictions. And Haley, can you talk a little bit about what stood out to you there?
Absolutely. So I want to couch my coming comments in the idea that every state is going to need to come to its own conclusions about what's appropriate and politically feasible. However, we have found that generally the fewer the restrictions, the better in the case of providing education, post-secondary education to incarcerated people. The link between participation and post-secondary programming and positive outcomes, as Josh mentioned, and these include outcomes like non-recidivism, employment, et cetera, it's very well defined. And we see strong evidence coming out of major prison higher education programs that a large proportion of incarcerated learners are indeed, quote, college ready. And to achieve the positive outcomes, we need to make sure that we approach prison higher education with a maximizing lens. How can we move away from scarcity and toward higher capacity programs? And one answer is to remove administrative and bureaucratic barriers. I'll just note that Ruth's comments about the structure and orientation of the programs in Minnesota is actually really important. She mentioned one particular angle that I'll highlight, which is the licensing restrictions. We didn't get into any great depth in that about that topic in this report, but it's really important to make sure that if you're training somebody in a field, that those folks are allowed to practice in that field. And in fact, working directly with the barbering and cosmetology entities is something that many places don't do, and indeed, many folks with criminal backgrounds are not allowed to serve in those occupations because of restrictive licensing requirements. So I want to just underscore everything that Ruth said. Sounds like a really amazing set of programs and opportunities. In addition, as noted in the report, most states restrict program eligibility or participation based on behavior. And whenever something is a pretty subjective decision, you will often find areas of bias. We'll encourage states to look at which populations are restricted to fully understand how these decisions may underscore those racial or other differences in access. And so, for example, if your high security or segregated population is looks different than your low security or non-segregated populations, you may have decisions resulting in racialized outcomes, and that's really something that we want to make sure is not happening. And particularly that higher education and access to the life-transforming aspects of higher education is not used as punishment. And still other states restrict access to particular programs based on the type of offense. Again, states need to be reasonable about it, but the decision about who gets what should not be arbitrary. The research, of course, also looked at, Josh, if you want to advance, at the college and university application process. And speaking about restrictions here, I don't want to get ahead of myself, Josh, making sure that you're okay with this leading into this next idea. Right, here we are. Public universities. We know about the correlations of having a criminal record in admission because, unfortunately, as we know, requiring applicants to disclose their criminal history really prevents many people from completing the application. And so we encourage states to take a look at the ban the box movement, which is growing in many states. It's important because that link between asking the question about criminal background on a college app and the learner with the application with the background not applying is real, even if the question is never taken into consideration in the application approval process. If we're looking to maximize talent, maximize access, we really need to think hard about the impact, intended or unintended, that these policies and practices have on human behavior.
Great, thank you, Haley. And I think your comments also just continue to reiterate, as others have, is just the importance of partnerships, that if we really want to build viable pathways for post-secondary education, it can't just be State Department of Corrections, it can't just be parole agencies, it does need to be workforce development agencies, it does need to be employers, and it does need to be higher education. One other highlight from the report, which is very recently the common application which many public universities and other universities use across the country for admissions, removed questions related to criminal history on the application. But what we found in our research is almost half of all universities actually added that question back. And as Haley really reinforced, research has shown that that is a disincentive for folks with criminal backgrounds, those who need education the most, from even applying. So it just really reinforces the importance of having a statewide strategy that involves multiple different kinds of entities for addressing post-secondary needs. With that, Gina, sure.
Sorry, Josh. If I could also add, it's been our experience, and granted recent experience, that because corrections folks are focused and have more than day jobs, and higher education people are focused on higher education and have more than day jobs, oftentimes, unless there are really intensive and intentional structures in between higher ed, corrections, workforce, that territory often goes untended. I really just want to underscore what you said about the importance of working in partnership across agencies, as well as enabling corrections folks to be fluent in higher education and higher ed folks to be fluent in corrections. It's really, really important.
Great. So with that, Gina, I'd like to turn to you, and if you can talk a little bit about, last but not least, building block, which is the importance of incentives and support.
Yes, thank you, Josh. As Haley mentioned, a range of barriers impacting people with involvement in the justice system. However, another tool or tools that can be used to assist with the enrollment and completion in post-secondary education is rewarding people with tangible incentives. And incentives may include housing that is designated for students or for those who are enrolled in a particular program, release from work requirements after release. It could also be compensating people for attending or completing courses. It could also be providing access to technology for personal use. Another crucial incentive is providing early release or earned credits for participating in and or completing these programs. And we often see this in parole decision making. So generally, a parole granting agency determines whether an individual is eligible for parole, and they may consider participation in post-secondary education while incarcerated. And so incentives like these for these early release or earned credits for participation in post-secondary education while incarcerated may assist individual for enrollment and completion in these programs. We also looked at services and support after release, And these services and support may encourage people to continue their education or enroll in post-secondary education. Support such as access to career and technical education training programs. It could also be vocational or credential testing, or any information on post-secondary education may give people the necessary tools to connect them to post-secondary educational opportunities when they return to the community. And so according to our research, we found that only 12 states have established tangible incentives and support in the correctional facilities as well as in the community upon release. As mentioned earlier, people may be awarded early release and earned credits for participation in post-secondary education while incarcerated. We did find that 36 states award sentence reduction, but only half of the states consider participation and or completion of educational programs when determining parole eligibility. Additionally, as a condition of parole, in terms of parole proceeding, a state may mandate that the person seek and maintain employment. We found that only 34 states allow participation or enrollment in post-secondary education to meet that requirement as a condition of parole, and 8 states require people to continue their education as a full-time student in addition to seeking or maintaining employment.
Great. Thank you, Gina. And, appreciate, as Haley mentioned before, that every state has to find their sort of comfort level with this, and that some might say, well, why are we providing incentives or rewards to folks in the criminal justice system for post-secondary education? But again, given the research that shows such significant benefits for the individual, for community safety, and for local and state economies, the benefits of providing those incentives in a way that encourage participation, encourage retention, and encourage completion are pretty overwhelming in terms of the benefits. So now we've identified some of the challenges and the state of the field, and a number of states still have a fair ways to go in terms of building these key building blocks. So I'd like to ask our panelists, Leah, starting with you, if you can encourage states in the field to focus on one key or critical or priority systems change or adopt one best practice to improve post-secondary access and quality for this population, what would it be?
So my best practice or system to improve upon would be the transparency over the funding being offered and used. So for federal funds, we have been in conversations with individuals in the DOC, institutions of higher ed, and state legislators, not really understanding or knowing what type of federal funds are being used for post-secondary education and how much is allocated for this service and who is providing this funding. And so sometimes the federal funds are not going through the DOC, but maybe going through the college or university providing those educational services. So the challenge is, how do we ensure that is captured somewhere and fully understood by all the parties involved? Now, further, I think that more work can also be done on reevaluating state financial aid policies and regulations. So, is Pell eligibility completely necessary in determining if one should qualify for this financial aid program? Is restricting individuals convicted of certain crimes indefinitely from accessing funding opportunities to continue their education necessary? Then I think that the question really becomes, how are the financial aid programs being tailored to support, quote, non-traditional students who are just as interested in pursuing a higher education? So although I fully acknowledge that each state has to adapt best practices to best reflect and meet their specific needs in the state, I do think there are some good models of this already happening, such as in Wisconsin and Iowa. So I believe that looking over the policies and the statutes that restrict certain groups of people from accessing the financial aid should also be a priority in each state.
Great. Thanks, Leah. Ruth, if you can answer the same question about what you think is key for states to focus on. And we've gotten a lot of questions already about collaborating with other entities, and particularly employers. And so if you can touch a little bit on that in your answer, that would be great.
Certainly. So I'm going to piggyback a little bit on Leah's response. Minnesota has been able to offer higher education in the prison facilities dating back to the 70s. At that time, we were able to utilize the Pell Grants, and when they went away in 1993, we didn't want to eliminate the opportunity for higher ed programming, so we secured a percentage of inmate phone commissions within the prisons to cover the costs, and that was also combined with the Federal Youthful Offender Grant, the SPECTR grant. Once those two funding streams could no longer support post-secondary, we were able to partner with our prison industry called MNCOR. With this funding, we have a partnership with a handful of colleges that come in and teach, so we're able to continue offering courses that are transferable to four-year degrees or to help complete an AA degree. In 2016, when the Pell Pilot opportunities became available, we had 3 Minnesota colleges get accepted as Pell Pilots, and then that allowed us to provide additional coursework. These include our South Central partner for the Mechatronics program, Pine Tech and Community College for our Certified Productions Technician program, and Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College for our Clean Energy program. And then because Pell Pilot programs can expand, we had Ashland University from Ohio expand in, they are a Pell College, to provide coursework towards a Bachelor of Arts degree in Communication Studies, and those students can also earn credits towards an AA degree in General Studies. It's offered via secure tablets because we have some of our population that is who are restricted to their cells, or there's no other prison job for them, so they can still partner or participate in higher ed. It is because of the Pell opportunities that we have been able to expand our higher education. But back to Leah's funding comments. In order to keep offering our higher ed opportunities or expand on them, it all depends on the state working on funding opportunities for people incarcerated in our prisons and jails. The continuance of Pell opportunities, any other types of funding we can get. When funding streams end, then we have to back off on our offerings. And Josh, can you tell me the second part of that question again, please?
Yeah, we've gotten a number of questions from participants about just how you get other agencies to the table, higher education, employers, to really partner with departments of corrections around maximizing funding, around alignment of programming. Do you have a formal structure for doing that in Minnesota? You talked a little bit about the advisory board. Can you just talk a little bit about how you engage those other partners?
Yes, we really do reach out to some of our other state agencies also. So our Department of Employment and Economic Development, DEED, they have career force centers. They also have workforce investment boards. They have their Career Force Center regional meetings, and we try to get out and communicate with all of their staff and their processes and share what we're doing inside of the prison. And then together we can work on reaching out to employers. There's always career fairs that are available in any of our counties, and our navigators attend the career fairs and share what we're doing inside of the facilities. We have some very positive experiences working with our state college system, and so reaching out to them to see how we can partner has been successful. So we're able to secure some private funding here and there, and that helps us expand on the higher ed. It's pretty much working with everybody together in the state to make things work well.
That's great. Thanks, Ruth. Haley, you've talked a little bit about states needing to sort of find their comfort zone around their restrictions. But if you were to give some advice or suggest some best practices around restrictions, what would that be, Haley?
Sure. I think best practice is an ambitious term, but promising, perhaps emerging. I would suggest thinking about this from an audit perspective. It's been my impression, Ruth mentioned the Violent Crimes Act of 1994, which really wiped out a lot of the ecosystem and infrastructure for higher education and prison programs when it removed Pell eligibility for incarcerated people. And so we're really in a rebuilding mode, and it's my impression that a lot of the policies and practices that are currently on the books, that are currently driving behavior, are products of another time. And the states, at least from my perspective, have created labyrinths that are really restrictive, obviously, to the potential learners inside the systems and are often very difficult to administer. And so I'd encourage states to really take a look backwards to enable them to move forward in a smarter way. Of course, this report definitely gets that work started. Beyond that, I'd really encourage states to take a look at data, especially where it describes differentiated outcomes between racial and ethnic groups, or where it suggests that access to programs and opportunities is being offered in an arbitrary or worse, biased way. Where are the places where folks are getting tripped up, derailed, or stopped fully in being able to do this work, which is, of course, a proven benefit to individuals. So really taking that deep exploration rather than planting in another program, let's figure out what's broken first and whether we can get it removed. We would also, of course, really encourage states to think critically about quality. Offering low-quality programs to an unrestricted group is not a solution either. So quality, at least from Lumina's perspective, credentials, require that any program offered inside a prison result in opportunities for further education, meaning it must transfer and result in a credential, and employment, meaning there must be an opportunity to connect that skill and learning to a job. So I mentioned the licensing restrictions. Offering a quality credential means that the person must be able to practice in the field in which the credential is earned, and that credential must be and must enable further post-secondary attainment and opportunity. So those are just a couple areas we'd ask states to really think about.
Great. Thank you, Haley. We've had a number of questions about the types of restrictions that Department of Corrections have instituted. And we can say a couple of the more common ones are restrictions based on offense, restrictions based on sentence length, restrictions based on security level, and then I think the most common one was restrictions based on behavior. And while that makes sense on the surface, as Haley has already talked about, the concern about that is that it can be arbitrary, it can be very discretionary about how such restrictions are applied. And a lot of these restrictions are actually restricting access to post-secondary education from the individuals who are generally the highest risk and could actually benefit the most from post-secondary education access. I guess the other thing that I'll add is that our report and our surveying also did look at what kind of learning methods that Department of Corrections were using. And what we found is that there was an opportunity to potentially be a little bit more creative with technology. And so even if there are restrictions about who's in a classroom or physical limitations around a space, that things like tablets can find a way to have individuals still taking advantage of higher education opportunities, just not always in a sort of group classroom setting. So with that, Gina, if you can talk a little bit about best practices or things that you would encourage states to consider when it comes to incentives.
Sure. In terms of support, we mentioned articulation agreements in our report, and we've seen increasingly employers are looking for job applicants with industry-recognized certificates and or associate and bachelor's degrees from accredited educational institution. And so these certificates refers to, it means that they are nationally and officially recognized credentials, generally recognized by an accredited educational institution. And we also see that some of the articulation agreements includes information about courses that are offered in correctional facilities are or should be equivalent to the courses offered in the community, as well as credits earned while incarcerated are transferable upon reentry. And so we've seen a formalized articulation which lays out the policies of the program, the transfer policies, and these articulation agreements could assist in ensuring the quality of post-secondary education programming that individuals are receiving while incarcerated, and ensuring that they are equivalent to the programming offered in the community. And while we have not really discussed in depth of the quality of these individual post-secondary education programs in our report, there are studies out there such as the Alliance for Higher Education and Prisons Equity and Excellence report that may assist states as well as schools with developing and implementing high-quality post-secondary education in state correctional facilities. And so this specific report details the standards and benchmarks for quality in developing correctional higher education programs. And so resources like that could assist states with implementing these programs.
Great. Thanks, Gina. I think it, again, speaks to clearly a common theme here, which is around collaboration. Obviously, particularly discouraging for an individual who's incarcerated to be moving forward with their education, earning credits, and then come out to the community, and given all the other barriers and challenges they face to reintegration, for there not to be articulation agreements where those credits can easily and seamlessly transfer to educational institutions in the community. And so again, just speaks to departments of corrections and higher education and workforce development agencies not doing things in isolation, but really working together to think about, from the moment a person is incarcerated through the reintegration process, how to create those seamless post-secondary pathways. Great. So now we'd like to continue to answer a lot of questions, and I'll apologize if we don't get to everyone's questions, because we got a lot of questions, which is great and signifies the interest in this topic. One of the questions, or a couple of the questions, are about sort of how do states get started really trying to strengthen these policies and practices, and where could both leveraging existing resources as well as additional resources make the most difference. Haley, I'd like to start with you if I can, because I know Lumina has been partnering with states to try to strategically build state capacity in this area. What have you seen work well, and where do you think there are opportunities for states to really work better together internally to make better use of resources?
That is the big question, and I wish I had a pat answer, but I don't. So I'm going to just try to fill in some of these blanks. I would really encourage folks on the phone and the people who are thinking at the state level to find the champion. Minnesota is a great example of really the leadership comes all the way from the top and goes into the system. Others, you got to find the right secretary or official within either side, the higher education side or the corrections side of the house, and get together to talk about how many people are involved. I actually have perceived that a lot of higher education folks probably don't know the degree to which people are incarcerated. They don't know how many people are in the system. They may not know how many people are cycling out. They may not be aware of how many people are accessing higher education inside or who need it outside, because it's just a gray area. It falls outside of a lot of folks' general mission, though there are, I think, some states that are handling it really wonderfully. So sitting down and having that initial conversation and figuring out what can we accommodate, what are our values, what are our priorities, and what could we set as an initial goal. Then taking a look to see within your system as you're developing, are there any programs? Ruth mentioned the Pell the Pell pilot sites as being sort of catalyst for expansion and growth. There are, 60 plus of those in the country. Taking a look and seeing what's working in your state is a great place to start. And then from the auditing perspective, I would really encourage you to take a look at this report and use it as a place to take a look back and see, do you fully agree with what's been reported in here? Do you have you uncovered another practice that might refute or contradict something that's been reported here, or complement it in a positive way, and so you can get a much better perspective on your current environment. Also, and this is just a note, I would be happy to hear from any states that are interested in learning a little bit more about what some of our state partners are doing, or learning more about what Lumina does in this space. So I'd encourage you to reach out as well. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Haley. We got a number of questions around incentives and how to make them meaningful and effective. Ruth, I know Minnesota has a number of those incentives. Can you talk a little bit about what those incentives are and what you've seen actually work?
Yes, certainly. We have quarterly or biannual graduation ceremonies where the students who complete a program actually wear cap and gown, and we have pomp and circumstance, we have guest speakers, and we make it very special for them. They will also get a certificate or diploma if they're in a career tech program, and those come from Minnesota State's college, Century College. And so it's an actual certificate or diploma that doesn't say School of the Prison System or however. And then if they're getting a higher ed degree of some type, then the leadership from that particular college comes in and gives them that award during that ceremony process. Some of the facilities allow family to attend. Some are not able to do that, but it's always special when family can attend. Any of the industry recognized certifications that they get, if it's a hard card, we'll mail it out to their home or put it in their file so they have it when they leave. Those are like little golden tickets that they can show an employer they actually completed something and that they have some higher level skills. Just lots of little things like that, little certificates in the classroom, and then again, if they're very focused and they're getting close to release and they work with a career navigator, they know they're going to get that support outside too. So lots of incentives there.
Great, thank you. Haley, I know you mentioned it wasn't formally included in the report, but you briefly talked about collateral consequences related to occupational licensing and sometimes higher education. And as we're encouraging states to take a look at their systems, that feels like a really important piece of the puzzle. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
Sure. So, I think it falls really neatly into this barriers question. Some of the collateral consequences and obviously the licensing restrictions, they're not purely about higher education access, and they're not behavioral based, and they're often not policy. What they do, though, is keep the incarcerated person, reentering person, from being able to fully re-enter society and to live their best life. We really encourage states to take a hard look at licensing. There were many sort of draconian restrictions put in over time, and many actually very vague clauses. The clauses that say you have to be of upstanding moral character, that kind of thing. Well, who decides that? So we're really supportive of states working through their collateral consequences to reduce those barriers, making sure that housing isn't restricted, making sure that access to the safety net isn't restricted, making sure that access to employment opportunities isn't restricted. based on past offense, while also taking a look forward and understanding that many of the occupations, particularly in the healthcare, the education services, construction, manufacturing, et cetera, are heavily regulated by licenses, and many people with records are restricted from them. They're not, of course, on the phone today. I'll point you toward the National Employment Law Project's work around licensing restrictions, which is just fantastic for a state perspective about where you fall in terms of, making too many restrictions on the ability to practice in an occupation.
Thanks, Haley. I'll also put a plug in for another resource, which is one that we've been operating, which is called the National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of Conviction. So we have been able to build a state database that is public and state folks in a state can go to, and it lists all of the collateral consequences, including all of the there's over 40,000 restrictions, including 12,000 mandatory restrictions having to do with occupational licensing and other issues. And so folks can use that free resource and search by their state to understand what those restrictions are, which, as Haley has mentioned, is really critical because if a Department of Corrections or a university or a community-based organization is developing pathways for post-secondary success and employment, you want to really make sure you're informed of those and so that those pathways aren't restricted to folks who are involved in the criminal justice system. Leah, I did want to ask you a question because there was a couple of questions related to Pell and a little bit of confusion about Pell eligibility restrictions versus maybe Pell second chance. And so if you could just talk briefly about that.
Sure. So in 2016, a number of states and universities were selected for the Second Chance Pell Pilot Program. That allowed these universities to provide Pell funding to then provide post-secondary education, so certifications, associate and bachelor's degrees in various correctional facilities across the U.S. That information can be found on the Department of Education website. When I said Pell restrictions, so Pell in general restricts incarcerated people from accessing that money, that award. And so some states will not have any explicit, like in their statute, in their law, there's no explicit line that says incarcerated people can't access our state financial aid. But they will sometimes say, or the policy or the practice of that institution that's awarding this aid, this state financial aid, says we use Pell eligibility to determine who is eligible to receive this financial aid. So what that then means is that inexplicitly that incarcerated people can't access it because of that caveat, because of that line. So.
Great. Thanks, Leah. So we're almost out of time, but there's one last question that I want to get to. And again, we'll get to some of these other questions over email, but a question that we're excited about, which was a question about what the next steps are and whether there's going to be state-based work. So we're really excited about taking this information and trying to partner with state leaders as part of our larger focus on economic mobility as well as on reintegration to really share this information directly with state leaders in a way that tries to motivate change. And so really do want to encourage any state folks on the phone that are interested in potentially working with us on that issue to reach out to us, and we'll provide some contact information because we're eager to hear from you. And we're eager, as Haley said, to really encourage states to take a hard look at their current policies and practices and to partner with you to try to improve them. I guess just before we go, Haley, any last word on that and where the Lumina Foundation is hoping to continue this work?
Thanks, Josh. No, we're just really excited to see more states taking up this mantle, make sure that they're being as inclusive as they can in considering the kind of talent that is behind bars and the kind of talent that's been excluded from post-secondary opportunity and the promise of a thriving life that post-secondary opportunity provides. So we're really grateful to the CSG Justice Center team for an exceptional job and hope to work with many of you in the future. We really appreciate it.
Great. Well, thank you to Leah and Gina and Haley and Ruth. We really appreciate your leadership and your time on this important study. And we thank everyone for participating, and we look forward to answering your questions and hopefully working with you moving forward.
Thanks, Josh. Take care.
Thank you.